The Caro-Kann is one of the most solid defenses that you can play with the black pieces. It's extremely easy to learn and can be absolutely devastating for your opponent if played correctly. In today's video, I'm going to show you exactly how to dominate your next opponent with the Caro-Kann. But first, let me give you an example of how dangerous the Caro-Kann can be. The Karl's Trap. The Karl's Trap is technically not an official trap line. It doesn't stray away from mainline Caro-Kann theory at all, and it just goes to show if your opponent doesn't know what they're doing, the game can end very quickly. In the year 1914 in Oldenburg, Germany, international master Karl-Johann Margot Karls played another German chess player recorded as Schuster. Because the game was played so long ago and occurred during World War I, the details of Schuster were not properly recorded. If you're wondering where you've heard the name Karl-Johann Margot Karls before, you might have heard it from an opening variation named after him, the Botvinnik Karl's Defense. We'll get to that opening variation later in the video, but first let's look at his game. Karls has the black pieces and the game follows mainline Caro-Kann theory until move 6, where his opponent plays the move bishop g5. Karls continues with the very provoking h4. There is only one move for white in this position, and it's knight e2. It's very difficult to spot. But what if you don't find that, and instead you play bishop takes f6? This is what Schuster played in the game, and it's very logical, because after black takes your knight, you're going to play bishop e5 and defend everything. It seems like white is in the clear, and after Karls captures on h2, his opponent recaptures with the rook, and it looks like if you just recapture with the pawn, the bishop is going to recapture, and white is completely fine. But unfortunately for Schuster, the game is already over because one of the most brutal traps in the Caro-Kann is about to be played. In 1914, Karls played queen a5 check, c3, and queen takes e5 check, sacrificing the queen. Schuster has no choice but to take this queen, and once he does, Karls is going to recapture the rook and inevitably promote to another queen, being up an entire piece just 12 moves into the game. In this position, Schuster resigned, and the Karl's Trap was born. Now that you know how sharp the Caro-Kann can be, let's get into the theory. The main line, and most other Caro-Kann lines for that matter, begins with e4, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, d takes e4, and knight takes e4. From this point, black already has multiple choices. The first is to play bishop f5, losing a tempo after knight g3 and bishop g6. This is called the classical variation. This is completely sound to play. However, I don't particularly recommend playing it because black's light-squared bishop ends up more of a target than a threat. In my opinion, in mainline variations boasting similar pawn structures, the light-squared bishop is usually more useful on the a8 to h1 diagonal. In these positions, white will essentially play a London system setup, already possessing an open e-file for its rook and much better piece fluidity than black. So instead, let's try something more challenging and go back a few moves. Instead of playing bishop f5, we could play the immediate knight f6. If white chooses not to trade knights, you can see how we've already reached a similar position without losing tempo on our bishop. If white does this, we're extremely happy. In this position, we can actually play h5 and set up the Karl's Trap. If bishop g4, h4, and you already force white to find the difficult move of knight 3 to e2. If they do find that tricky only move defense, just continue with bishop f4, which now is available because we always have the h7 square to retreat to if we're attacked. I won't go on about this position too much more, as it's obviously very pleasant for black to play. White's pieces are uncoordinated, there's a loose pawn on b2, queen a5 check tactics, and as long as you don't end up hanging your advanced h-pawn, black is well and truly in the driver's seat. But what if they don't retreat their knight, and instead capture on f6? Well, now we have one of two choices. Either g takes f6, which is the Bronstein-Larsen, or e takes f6, which is the Tartakower. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining why, but personally, I don't like the Bronstein-Larsen at all. A fantastic characteristic of the Caro-Kann is that the pawn structure is extremely advantageous when trading into endgame. games. Whilst the doubled pawns are not too much of an issue, the isolated flank pawn definitely can be. The Bronstein-Larsen takes away that single benefit, and in return you don't really gain much that the Tartakower doesn't offer. So instead, if you do choose to play this variation, I would recommend the Tartakower, which is e takes f6. The Tartakower immediately challenges white's open e file, which in the main line we highlighted as a major strength for white. Typically, white will be forced to play c3 here, to consolidate its weak pawn in the center. From here, bishop d6 should almost always be your next move, preparing to castle your king to safety. If you're checked, bishop e6, and white has helped you develop. But bishop d3 is the most common move, to which you simply castle. The game from here is extremely simple to play. In whichever order you see fit, bring your rook to e1, bring your bishop to g4, e3, or even sometimes f5, and bring your knight to d7 and commonly reroute to f8. If this position looks slightly dull to you, that's exactly the point of the Caro-Kann. The entire point of this opening is to avoid theory-heavy lines like the Sicilian has and quickly equalize with the black pieces. Before we look at the next section of the Caro-Kann though, let's quickly look at the Karpov. When white played knight takes e4, we actually had another option, which is the move knight d7. The idea of the Karpov is very similar to that of the Tartakower, but instead of recapturing with a pawn, you recapture with another knight. Very importantly, if after knight d7 white plays queen e2, do not play knight gf6. This is the fastest way to lose in any Caro-Kann line, with knight d6 being a smothered checkmate for white. Instead, play knight df6. If white captures on f6, recapture with your other knight. If they play something else, like knight f3, immediately capture their knight on e4 and follow up with knight f6, applying tempo in the center. If bishop f5 is ever possible for you, you should play it. But if white plays queen f4, which is the only move stopping bishop f5, play knight d5. If white continues to hinder the development of your light squared bishop, play g6 and fianchetto your dark squared bishop, castle kingside, put your bishop on the a8 to h1 diagonal, and prepare e6 or e5. Oftentimes, you will have some tactics which make that move possible. If instead they allow you to freely play bishop f5 with a move like queen e3 for example, you should almost always play it. White is forced to play c3 to not lose the hanging pawn. From there, play h6 and allow your bishop some extra space. If white offers a trade of light squared bishops, accept it. From here, e6 should be played, opening up the dark squared bishop. Possible moves from here are bishop d6, bishop e7, knight d6, queen b6, and short castles. But from this point on, you essentially have equalized as black. If instead of queen e2, white plays knight f3, the ideas are virtually exactly the same. However, this time you'll play knight gf6 instead of knight df6. If black captures on f6, recapture with your knight and apply the exact same concepts. However, if black plays knight g3, your bishop will now need to sit on the a8 to h1 diagonal, facilitated by a move like b6. If you're going to play the Karpov or Tartakower, I highly encourage you to go and watch some of Witty Alien's videos on the Alien Gambit, as you'll undoubtedly be met with some people who want to try it. Witty's a good friend of mine and has done an excellent job explaining it on his channel. I'll leave the links to those videos in the description. The Advanced Variation. The Advanced Variation is personally my favorite to come up against because you get to utilize the Botvinnik-Karl's defense, meeting e5 with c5. Typically, your opponent will not know the theory to this as it's quite unorthodox. Just quickly as well, instead of c5, you can play bishop f5. I personally don't recommend bishop f5 however, as the Botvinnik-Karl's is much more dynamic and gives black lots of winning chances. Similarly to the main line we looked at earlier, bishop f5 allows the bishop to be targeted, resulting in lost tempo and constricted position. Now back to the Botvinnik-Karl's. If d takes c5, immediately attack the loose pawn with knight c6. If knight f3, pin the knight to the queen with bishop g4. If white allows you to, capture the pawn on e5. However, if they pin your knight to your king, play queen a5 check, knight c3, and e6. The idea is to recapture the pawn you've gambited. Oftentimes, your opponent will allow you to recapture very swiftly to avoid your theory. However, this is inherently wrong, because allowing the recapture of one pawn, for example the c5 pawn, leaves the e5 pawn very weak, allowing black to target it. If white misplays for a single move, the pawns will both fall. For example, if after e6, bishop d2, queen c7, here, white cannot hold both pawns and needs to play b4. This allows bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, queen takes e5 check, queen e2, queen takes e2, and knight takes e2. Here, black has completely equalized and has an advantageous pawn structure in any endgame. But even if white plays more accurately with bishop e3, we play knight e7. Not only is there only one good move for white here, but the position is objectively worse if they don't find it, even though they've played the best moves up until this point. White needs to find a6, preparing b4. Queen c7 is completely fine here, if not slightly better for black. If white ever tries to kick our light squared bishop, we always take on f3. On many occasions, black can actually even queenside castle here, leading to an advantageous opposite side castling position. What I meant by castling long was when white tries this move, bishop d4. It's a completely natural move because it looks like black will never escape this pin, allowing the knight to partake in the action. For example, if the knight weren't pinned and we played a move like a6 and for some reason the bishop went all the way back, then we could take this knight. You can't take with the queen because then the bishop would fall, and if you take with the pawn, we play knight f5, and you can see that the position is completely crushing here. Black's in the center of the board, the pawns are terrible, and the best move here is actually knight takes d5, because after you take, white wants to solidify their position like this. White is probably going to play bishop a4 though, but then you long castle, evading the pin. The best move here for white is b4, but this is still very good for black because we're going to take this bishop. You can't take with the knight because of this pin, so the queen has to take, but now we take the knight. Double the pawns and knight f5 arrives, and you can't defend this pawn anymore. By the way, you can't play queen f4 because of the move g5, and if you take this pawn, we're going to check and pick up the knight. If you try to defend it, queen d4 check comes, and we're going to force the knight off the board. If instead they immediately snap off this knight, we're going to recapture with our knight, and the same problems exist, except this time we didn't even have to castle. But it doesn't really matter, because white's defenses have been stretched. The e-pawn will fall, the c-pawn will always be doubled and weak long term, and black has left the opening in an advantageous position, despite white playing all of the best moves. So now that we've established that even with optimal play, d takes c5 isn't quite viable for white, what if they just play c3? Here, we can immediately play knight c6. If they take on c5, it simply transposes into what we've already looked at. If knight f3, bishop g4, and we capture the knight if we're either kicked with h3 or the pin is broken with bishop e2. If bishop b5, pinning our knight, we capture on d4, and after white recaptures, we freely play bishop f5. If knight f3 now, I recommend the very unorthodox move bishop g4. We're moving the same bishop twice in a row, mainly because we didn't have any good moves previously apart from bishop g5, because we wanted to play e6 without blocking in the bishop. At the lower levels, knight d2, bishop takes f3, knight takes f3, and queen a5 check is a nice trap, picking up the bishop. However, this is hopeful. Black will play bishop e3, to which we reply with e6. Continuing from here in no particular order, we bring our knight to e7, rerouting to f5 to pressure the d4 pawn. Our rook comes to c8, our bishop sits on e7, and we castle kingside. Queen b6 can be played at moments, with a big goal of targeting the weak and awkward to defend d4 pawn. If white springs forward with f4 at any point, f5 can be a useful defense, allowing en passant to activate the kingside rook. The main point of this line is to target white's overextended pawns and win endgames with the advantageous pawn structure. Black is very happy here, and enjoys pleasant activity against white. The fantasy variation. The fantasy is a very difficult variation, but I do want to highlight one common line I face quite often. When white plays f3, simply play e6. Knight c3 will come next and will pin the knight with bishop c4. If bishop d2, black has almost lost already. After bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, d takes e4, f takes e4, we have queen h4 check, picking up the pawn. But to be completely honest, the fantasy is a massive can of worms in the Caro-Kann. There is no easy way for me to explain it, as apart from this one specific line, I'm not a massive expert on it myself. By no means is the fantasy a weak area of mine, I simply don't know a great deal of theory to it. I could sit here and tell you everything an engine tells me, but I don't think that's useful nor genuine. I don't want to leave you empty-handed though, so I'll link you to some great videos by Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky on the fantasy variation in the description. The Panov and Accelerated Panov. The Panov and Accelerated Panov are extremely dangerous weapons against the Caro-Kann, and it's vital you understand how to get your way in these openings. First, we'll look at the Accelerated Panov. E4, C6, C4. We first respond with D5, allowing all the pawns to be traded in the center with E takes D5, C takes D5, and C takes D5. It's very important not to play Queen takes D5 here, as Knight C3 would arrive with tempo. Instead, play Knight F6, applying extra pressure to the pawn. White can respond in a few ways. First, we'll look at Bishop B5 check. In this position, you'll want to block with Knight BD7. If you block with your bishop, white can actually just hang on to the pawn with its bishop, as you've blocked your queen's sight and can't develop your knight. If Knight C3 further defending the central pawn, play A6, kicking away the bishop. If bishop takes D7 check, play queen takes D7, and the central pawn will become indefensible and you'll easily capture it. You can continue from here however you like, but it's most important to know the main idea is that you must keep a knight on D5 and target white's isolated queen pawn for the entirety of the game. It's your biggest weapon. If bishop a4 instead of bishop takes d7 check, play b5. If bishop b3, play knight c5, threatening to win the light squared bishop whilst taking a defender away from the central pawn. The same thing applies if white plays bishop c4 instead of bishop a4. Simply play b5 and knight c5. Once the defenders are removed, recapture the central pawn with your knight. In most of these accelerated Panov positions, e6 is played, the light square bishop ends up on b7, the dark square bishop ends up on g7 or d6, and black castles kingside. It's also important to note that whenever white commits their pawn to the d4 square, it's almost always good to capture their knight on c3 if they haven't traded it off already. This is because a backwards pawn will be just as easy to target as an isolated pawn, in some cases easier. However, if capturing the c3 knight can be met with d takes c3, don't play it. If instead of bishop b5 check, white plays knight c3, just take with the knight in the center. If knight f3 or d4, play knight c6. In this kind of position, the light squared bishop ends up on f5 or g4. The dark squared bishop ends up on e7 and black castles kingside. It's also important to note that if white ever plays bishop c4, you should play knight b6 applying tempo. White will try to trade off its isolated queen pawn by adding as much defense as it can to the d5 square. If queen e2, take the bishop and allow white to trade off its isolated pawn at the cost of the bishop-knight exchange. If bishop b3, play e6. White cannot play d5 here, as after knight takes d5, knight takes d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop b4 check, bishop d2, bishop takes d2, knight takes d2, knight b4, and bishop d3. Long castles is crushing here for black, as white's king cannot leave the knight's defense, and if the knight moves, rook he8 check will come, and so will knight d3 check. This is a long line to remember, but even if you don't remember this line, know you've already equalized as black here and should be able to easily continue playing without theory. Now let's quickly look at the regular Panov. The regular Panov occurs after e4, c6, d4, d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, and c4. Here, start with the simple knight f6. If they take your pawn, take with the knight and this transposes, but they'll likely play knight c3, adding pressure. Continue with development here with knight c6. If they play knight f3, play bishop g4. You should be prepared to trade your bishop for the knight on many occasions. If bishop g5 now, we play d takes c4. If bishop takes f6, e takes f6, and we follow similar principles to that of the Tartakower. Here, black cannot recapture the pawn because of queen e2 check. Queen e2 is not possible because the d pawn will fall. Knight e2 and bishop e2 are also not possible because of bishop takes f3. But if instead of bishop takes f6, white immediately plays bishop takes c4, just play e6. After short castles, it's imperative that you play h6. The Panov is extremely sharp, so you need to remember remember this or your king will be exposed. If bishop takes f6 now, queen takes f6 and d5 is not possible because of either long castles, which is extremely sharp, or simply playing bishop takes f3, doubling white's pawns and evading danger. If bishop h4, holding the pin, we play bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and queen takes d4. We are winning a pawn here, but allow white to double our pawns. You're mostly out of the woods here, but don't be lazy in this position as white can create unstoppable counterattacks if you don't defend your position. If bishop f4, play bishop d6 and force the trade. If bishop takes d6 and queen takes d6, white can play d5. Here we play e takes d5, and after rook e1 check, we play the dazzling king f8. Manually castling, and we're still slightly better here. If white wastes any time, defend the central pawn with rook d8. If they capture with the bishop first, capture with the knight. If they capture with the queen, allow the trades and double their pawns with bishop takes f3. If they capture with the knight, play rook d8, and after knight c3 back, queen f6 will win the game as you'll win the pawn. If instead they initially capture with the knight, play rook d8 and this still transposes. If knight takes f6, queen takes f6, and you essentially have the same position, except sometimes you'll have to settle simply for doubled pawns. Yes, I know this is very deep theory, but the Panov is so exceptionally sharp, and if your opponent knows the theory, you need to as well. If your opponent, however, strays away from one of the lines I've shown, just know there is a high likelihood that you're better positionally. Not only is the Panov sharp for black, but it's also sharp for white. The exchange variation. The exchange variation is a breath of fresh air in comparison to other variations we've looked at. It starts with e4, c6, d4, d5, e takes d5, and c takes d5. After bishop d3, play knight f6. This is extremely simple to play from here, so I'll quickly just note some key characteristics. The light square bishop should pin the knight whenever it lands on f3. e6 should be played. The dark square bishop will either be fianchettoed on g7 or be brought to e7 or d6, depending on the situation. The knights should land on f6 and c6, and black castles kingside. The reason I'm only listing these is that you don't really need to know theory here. White has no traps or special dangerous lines to go down here, and you've essentially already equalized. However, there is one tricky line I will show you that can be difficult to navigate. After knight f6, white can play h3. This prevents your light squared bishop from ever developing. Here, just play knight c6. If knight f3 arrives, play knight b4, and white is forced to either give up the light squared bishop or lose control of the diagonal you want to control. If instead of knight f3, c3 is played, play g6 and fianchetto the dark squared bishop. After knight f3, bishop g7, castles, bishop f4, you can actually play bishop f5 cleanly here. If the bishops are traded, you recapture with the pawn, and lock the pawns in with e6. Here, you have knight e4 ideas and king h8 ideas with rook g8 to come. The doubled pawns are very useful and you've fully equalized with nice attacking potential. The Breyer variation. The Breyer is the final variation we'll look at. It starts with e4, c6, d3, d5, and knight f3. The Breyer isn't very theory heavy. You play d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d1, king takes d1, and play this queenless game. This is already equal for black and a terrible way to play for white. Essentially, whoever is better at endgames will win from this opening. Funnily enough, you will rarely draw despite having no queens. If you think you're bad at endgames and this looks scary for you, you have two options. The first is to practice them and master the endgame. The second is to never play the Caro-Kann. The Caro-Kann is extremely positional and heavily relies on advantageous pawn structures to enter marginally winning endgames. It's the biggest asset of the opening. You don't need to know too much theory, and once you've stopped whatever white's attack may be, the tables turn and suddenly you're the one asking questions in the endgame. If this isn't for you, that's completely fine, but you've got to remember you're playing with the black pieces here, you don't get to have all of the fun. The Caro-Kann is extremely effective with the black pieces. However, to properly enjoy the Caro-Kann, you need to be competent and efficient in the endgame. I play the Caro-Kann myself, and to highlight how important the endgames are in the Caro-Kann, in the last 90 days, I've played 76 rapid games. 84.2% of the games I played with black were decided in the endgame, as opposed to just 64% of the games I played with white. I average 80% accuracy during the endgames, so you certainly don't need to be perfect at them, just proficient in them. I hope you've all enjoyed this video on the Caro-Kann defense, and hopefully I've provided enough of an insight on these variations. Again, I apologize for skipping over the fantasy variation. I'm currently studying it myself, and I didn't feel completely comfortable teaching something I wasn't overly knowledgeable in. Regardless, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.